if our work happens just before the QA step, this means that if for whatever reason we need more time, then we are impacting the launch dates and we are impacting the QA time.
Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, translation, and global communication.
Today, we have the pleasure to be speaking with Aglaia Pavlerou, an experienced professional in the localization industry. She has worked across different areas like translation and project management, and currently focuses on product localization at TICE. In this episode, Aglaia will be sharing valuable insights from her extensive experience in localization. We are going to be discussing important topics around achieving a consistent user experience across different cultures and markets during the localization process. I'm very excited about this conversation around localization best practice through an inclusivity lens. So, let's get started.
Hello, Aglaia, and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you? Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, I'm good, and thank you for agreeing for this interview. So today we're going to talk about UX localization and inclusivity. But before we jump right into the topic, would you mind telling a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background is in translation and linguistics, and I started off my career working for LSPs, working in different areas: resource management, vendor management, project management, local approval management, so managing the feedback from our clients. And then I moved on into similar positions in other industries. I spent some time in the travel industry, advertising, and right now I'm on the client side, focusing on product localization.
Well, that's quite a lot of experience in different fields. So that's really interesting. And as I said, the topic is going to be UX localization and inclusivity. So can we start maybe from let's say a simple or more general question, how do you ensure that the user experience remain consistent across different cultures and markets during the localization process?
So I think it definitely has to do with the localization journey of every company and where they are at the moment. It is very difficult to, let's say you are a localization manager and you join a company as the first person looking after that function. It's very difficult to expect to reach that goal within your first or your second year. You kind of have to go through, let's say, a hierarchy of needs. You need to ensure first that the whole product is translated / localized. And then, of course, you start looking into some basic references that you can use in order to reach that point. So obviously, you have to have your terminology straightened out. You need to ensure that not just as a localization manager with your translation partners, whether that's in-house, outsourced, LSPs, do the best that you can, but you also need to make sure that people internally are very happy with your work and, of course, your audience. So you have to have those feedback sessions and feedback loops where you basically ensure that all the assumptions and informed decisions you've made during localization are the right one for your audience. So I kind of see this as a very long process that you don't get it right straight away, but it's something that you go back and improve. And then, of course, as I also say to my translators, you can always change your mind, because sometimes it's very difficult to make a decision at the beginning of the process that's going to work always further down the line, especially if you work on a product that halfway through this process changes or the offering of the product changes. Then there's all these other things to consider, adapt and move forward again.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I like the thing. Yeah, I mean, it's always having an idea of what are the priorities. You cannot do everything all at once. You need to have priorities and have a plan, and a plan that is, let's say, agile enough that can adapt over time. It makes absolute sense. And I think you touched on something that we hear often when we talk about localization, having many different stakeholders involved, obviously with different needs and points of views and pain points. So that's also it's usually juggling different point of views and needs. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the main things that even as a translation project manager, you do, one of the first things that you learn, and this is such an important skill, I think, for our industry, is to manage people expectations, but also managing these very kind of fragile relationships. You represent the translators' very hard work. They feel very personally about the work. At the same time, you deliver this work to people who are going to be using it every day. You need to make sure their needs are met. So you're in the middle, trying to keep things to the point, civilized, give some wins there, ask people sometimes to take a step back. But I think it's this holistic understanding of both sides that you bring in and help things move forward and try to come away with actionable feedback, make feedback specific and actionable, and also leave some way for some subjectivity, which is always part of the process. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it is challenging to be like a mediator all the time. And about challenges, can you provide some examples or challenges that you face in ensuring inclusivity in UX localization, and how did you address them?
So this is a topic that I'm very interested in. And as a translator and linguist myself, translating into Greek, I can see how in English we have been able to establish a lot of different options, becoming more inclusive in our language, but also in the design of digital products. And I think sometimes, and forgive the pun, it's difficult to translate into other markets, literally and metaphorically. One of the main constraints is the gendered languages, where you kind of have to be more specific. And then, of course, you have to always compromise in order to be inclusive. You might come up with longer sentences that then they don't probably look the best within the design. You have to be a little bit more long-winded to explain exactly what the English copy is saying and being inclusive as well. And then, of course, the design might be a little bit compromised. So it's always a balance between everything. And especially with the gender languages and the special symbols that we're using in some of the European markets, for example, which is our focus here at DICE, there's not much information and research into how compatible they are with on-screen readers. So basically, we start with solutions that do not work every time. For example, for Spanish, using the X to include all genders is great. It's a great solution, but only in writing. So when you have to read something out, then it doesn't work. Then you have to go back to using both forms. This is a topic that I'm really interested in, and I would love to see the linguists from other markets coming together, exploring the solutions and having more research into this field, because I do believe, and going back to your first question, how do we ensure that the user experience is great in all the markets? This is one of these things that we need to look into, so that whether you are based in the UK or the US or anywhere else in the world, and you might have some accessibility needs, you can have the same great experience using a product.
That's true. And I see like it is challenging. And I'm wondering, how do you prioritize inclusivity and diversity in the localization process while maintaining the product coherent? So how do you do that? How do you juggle? Or maybe some pointers? I know it's challenging.
So sometimes there might be a solution on a case-by-case basis. We also work very well together as a team. Just to go back to the setup of our localization process, we collaborate with freelance translators for every language that we support. We have this very close-knit team. And then what we do is we do come across challenging copy, especially when there are placeholders, and the placeholder could be absolutely anything. So what we normally do is the team will share some interesting kind of techniques to go around it. So if there's a solution that works maybe in Italian, that might also work in Spanish. So we do share these findings. And then I think we also see it on a language by language basis. So some languages, they have an easier time going around these issues. And in some other cases, we just have to compromise. So for example, for Portuguese, we have to include both versions. And it's not the best example, but for now, we put priority on inclusivity, which might not be the most kind of finessed example when you have these longer sentences and you have to include both forms. But we decided this is going to be our first approach. So we start with this, and further down the line, we we reassess.
Following up on this, there's two questions actually I have. One is, you said like you share the findings. Let's say there's a solution in Spanish that might work in Italian. How do you share it? Do you have, let's say, a Slack channel where all the translators are in, or do you have an email chain out? Do you have a forum? I don't know.
Yeah, so this is also one of the questions that very often comes up when thinking what's the best way to discuss these questions, but also not just within translators, but also how do the translators communicate with, I don't know, the product designers, the UX writers. So I think for the translation team, the best way to do this is within the context. So it's so much easier when you discuss anything by saying the source copy, the other languages, and also if we're talking about product localization, the key name, because the key name will always include information about the area of the product, the theme, the feature, and then its use. So very often with really short keys, that's where the clue is, whether something is a CTA or maybe a headline. And then, of course, we have the visual. So very often we will have the design file linked for every single key that we translate. So within that context, we can ask these questions and the whole team can jump in and have all of this overview. We usually do it within our TMS. Then if it's something that might be a little bit more generic, that might be worth discussing further, we have a Slack channel, and then we have a monthly catch-up where the team comes together. I think this is great to kind of hold that time for everybody to come together. Very often when there's nothing on the agenda, things come up that is actually, we realize that everybody has been struggling with the same issue.
Okay, that's nice. And it brings, people together as well. So especially with the digital world, sometimes it's a bit difficult, just names on the screen. So lovely. Yeah. Is it like a video call?
Yeah.
How many people do you have in the language team? Just understand how big the video call is.
It's just 5 translators at the moment. So we're not really sure where the DICE journey will take us next. Since I started, there have been discussions about many different markets that we might be potentially be moving into. But for now, and also with the activity that every market goes with, we're focusing on Europe, at least for my team. And we do have presence in North America, in the US and Canada. I'm thinking potentially French-Canadian might be the next addition to my portfolio. So we'll see. It will be very interesting. Yeah.
And the other follow-up question I had actually was about do you have some kind of like style guide for inclusivity, or is it like a specific guide for each market, or is it just general guidelines that you give and then every, let's say, language specialist applies it as best they can?
So this is one of the first few things that we tried to agree on when we started working with the freelance translators. As I said, not so much about figuring out the best way, sticking to it moving forward, but just so that we can have consistency. So the things that we tried to figure out at the beginning was the way of addressing our audience. So we have 2 separate audience at DICE. We have our B2C and B2B. So we had to make sure that if we're going to make a distinction, what that would be, and potentially even with our B2B materials, whether it would always be, for example, plural or maybe initially plural when we are maybe looking into potentially new partnerships. But then, of course, when somebody has been a partner with us for a long time, maybe we switch to singular. I think this varies from industry to industry. And as being part of the music industry, I think there is a lot of people are very, very informal. It's the nature of the business. So we're taking this into consideration together with, of course, what our other internal teams suggested that. So form of address was the first one. And then the second one was inclusivity. So how do we want to approach this? And also, I keep talking about hierarchy because that's the thing that clicked for me when thinking, how do I approach this when none of the solutions work very well? And I attended a webinar a few months ago, and this is the main thing that they said. You have a few options and you go through that hierarchy to see what works every time. It cannot be just one solution. So yeah, for every language, so that's specific to every language, the approach is slightly different. We have an inclusive language section in the style guide where we describe our approach. So for example, for Italian, where can we use maybe in terms of nouns, more group nouns that kind of group people in a different way rather than having to specify the gender? where can we change the structure of the sentence so we don't have to specify who, let's say, we're talking to. So basically, where can we use everything else before we have to use the special characters? And then with the special characters, some examples of where this can be applied, maybe different areas of the product. So it's not as developed in all the languages. I think in some of the languages, also depending on the materials that come our way, we have these more relevant examples that can help us go into more detail.
Okay. No, I mean, it makes sense to have it like not just one single approach, but adapted according to the market. Because as well, like the sensibility, I think, and the language specificity are different in different languages. So as you said, like in English, there are some solutions that don't really work in other languages. And regarding the design side of things, what do you do to ensure that the localized UX designs align with the cultural values and norms of a specific region? So is there like if you maybe need to do some changes to the design in a specific market, how do you go about it? How do you decide whether to do it, whether not to do it, and how to approach that with in general, with the other teams as well?
Obviously, all the work that our product team does is based around making a product that will work in all our markets and will be available and easy to be used by everybody. We also have the privilege to have multicultural teams, so everybody brings a different perspective in that sense. Even within the design team, we have people speaking different languages. So I think that kind of perspective is really, really useful. But also anything new that's been worked on or anything that is being updated, it's been reviewed internally by different stakeholders. So the feedback process is very, very long. So in terms of the design and the UX copy, this is refined again and again. So by the time we sort of lock this in and we go into localization, we've already preempted any issues and we have looked into alternative options that might work. So, for example, at the moment, just to give you an example, we are reviewing some updates to our style and maybe introducing some illustrations to the app. There was one illustration where we thought that this is very well linked with the English copy, but the English copy would not work. We don't have this phrase in the other language, it would not work. So how do we just focus on the illustration and just try to do something very close to that? Do we need to change the illustration maybe to have something that would work with the ideal copy in the other languages? And essentially what we did, we went back to the UX writing team and we said, so obviously we're having a hard time, working with this copy. If we can make some assumptions of alternative things that we would say, so can we also say this at this stage of the user journey with this illustration? Can we say that? Which one of these options do you think it would also work? And the UX writers will guide us to the alternatives, because also by the time they reach to this final one line, they have considered so many variations, and there might be others that they rejected that are just a little bit further down. And this is the part of the creative process that we're interested in. So we go back, we explore these alternatives, and then we move forward. And in some of these cases, we might actually take it one step further and do a transcreation exercise rather than just try to localize that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. So it's like a little bit of a compromise and negotiation at every stage, even within the translation step, in the sense like the language decision that are made. Yeah, it makes absolute sense. And you mentioned already, so you anticipated what I wanted to ask you about, is like the collaboration with other teams, in the sense, like, I'm curious, first of all, to understand where the, let's say, development process, the localization fits in, what stage or what stages are you involved? Because it sounds like, you're in very close contact with the design and team. So you just understand where you come in or where you're asked like to have a look at the copy before it's actually locked in. And then to understand in general, how do you work? How you ensure that with the different teams, developers, designers, they integrate inclusive design principles into the localized UX, not only because sometimes it's only focused on the English design. And then when it gets localized, a lot of work that's been done by designers and developers gets kind of lost. So to understand a little bit better that dynamic.
Sure. So first of all, I think one question that comes up very often when we're talking about product localization is, where does the localization team sit within a company like this? I think that just this one answer tells you a lot about how the localization fits in the process in each company. So I know from other colleagues that might be sitting within the marketing division, the growth division, but I think, and I ask and I discuss this every few months with the team here, I think it is important for us to sit within the product team. And that's because we can be involved in the design and the development process, but also we need to have a very good knowledge of the product in order to be able to then support all the other activities. So in order to be able, for example, to write a promotional copy or write an email to our partners announcing new product features, you have to be involved from the start. So you have to have localized that new product feature, write some user guides for it. And then when you get to write the mail copy, you already know everything about it. So it's easy. And also you don't reach a point thinking, okay, so how are we going to translate that product name? Because we also have this other product name that is very similar in the language. So you don't have to make those decisions then. So going back to where I sit in the process, a few months ago, I sort of moved within the product team to sit now within the design team. So I sit together with the designers and the UX writers, the researchers. And I think this is the best spot for me and the team. This means that we are involved in the process before it reaches localization. So before everything is finalized and locked. We're currently changing the rest of the process so that we're not just present in this and providing feedback in this process, but also we start our work right after copy is finalized. So right now what we do is we wait for everything to be developed and then pick up things from when the keys are created. So we want to move this up a little bit, mainly to give us more time to, if our work happens just before the QA step, this means that if for whatever reason we need more time, then we're impacting the launch dates and we are impacting the QA time. And then of course, there might be no time to QA the other languages and only English is QA'd, or the other languages are QA'd really quickly. So we're in the process of bringing this forward. And I think it is the ideal scenario, at least for us. I think there were a few more sub-questions within your question, so maybe we need to pick these up again. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I completely agree. And it's true because sometimes like localization get kind of squeezed in at the very end. So there's no time for, like, there's no buffer. There's no, sometimes it's things that has to be sacrificed, like testing, which is actually from a UX point of view is very important. Yeah. And it might get sacrificed because there's no time before the release. So it makes absolute sense. And as well, like getting like involved early in the process allows sometimes to catch things like what you mentioned before, like the image. This image doesn't really work in any other language. So one thing is to know that while they're still designing the feature, and another is like when they've already locked everything and they've gone through the validation, and you're just like, let's say in the translation at the very end, right before the release, like maybe in 1 or 2 weeks, you have to release and you cannot go back and change the design or it's very complicated to do so.
Yeah. It's much easier, if I can use a surfing metaphor, it's so much easier to catch the big wave when it comes out in terms of something being released than then swim back and try to update something initiated by you when there are no waves coming. So yeah, it's so much easier to provide feedback and potentially influence some decisions while things are being worked on. Because also the product teams, our squads, they have so much in the pipeline. Their schedules are really, really tight. And because it's such a long process and so many people involved, every step needs to be wrapped up on its own time. So yeah, it's very difficult once you finalize something to go back and pick it up. It would have to be a very important update that is important for the business to be able to go back and update something. So yeah.
And the other part of the question, which is still connected to this, how do you work with other teams to ensure that all the other teams like designers, developers integrate inclusive design principle? Like how do you coordinate? Do you have like a meeting with them, regular meetings, or do you have like shared channel? Even like operational insights like that will be really useful.
We do have some accessibility guidelines, and then of course we have some set design principles. So the designer team, even though they do work individually and they work on B2C and B2B side. So sometimes the work doesn't really cross over. However, they have this, in a way, let's say a design Bible that key approaches and themes are agreed and they go back to an update whenever there are any important updates. So in that sense, this is something that trickles down to everything that they do. And in terms of in the programming stage, depending on the feature, there will always be some accessibility keys that are being programmed in so that we are able to support that side of the user journey. And there are so many things that I've learned that I hadn't come across before. So, for example, when you are adding copy that is going to be read out by a screen reader, you always have to add a full stop at the end, even if it's just one single word, so that the screen reader knows that's the end of that message. So even if you say bye, close, go back, it always needs a full stop so that it is obvious that this is the end and you're not expecting anything else to come after that. And as I said, it's an area of interest for me and I'm still learning about it. So I'm not fully aware of everything that the other teams are implementing. And I think it's also one of these areas where you can never say, okay, I think we're done now. We're doing this very well. I think it's an area of continuous improvement. Yeah, across all of the teams.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can always do better. Yeah, that makes sense. Before we wrap up, will you have something else that we didn't discuss that you think will be really interesting or important to say about this topic, UX inclusivity in localization?
I think something that I hadn't been aware of and I recently learned in this course that I've been attending is that it's also important to kind of avoid using language that might describe actions that potentially people with accessibility needs might not be able to do. So that was something that I completely ignored. And that was, for example, one of the reasons why we recently updated one of the phrases that we have been using in the app, which is buy a ticket in 3 taps. So you make the assumption that everybody can tap on the screen and buy a ticket. However, that's not the case. And this is something that people don't see it. It's really important. And once you start seeing it, then you realize that, yeah, we can actually, find a way not to use these sort of descriptive verbs and go for something else. So learning something new every day. And I think it's some of these new areas that are adjacent to localization that are really interesting and always evolving. I have to say, I do enjoy the last few years, the way our industry is expanding and kind of taking in other areas of work. It has made localization so much more exciting. So, yeah. Yeah,
and I think it's like in general, the fact that realizing more and more how cross-functional it is, it touches so many different fields. You need to know at least a little bit of it, in a sense, to be able to at least be aware. As you said, the example you gave me was great because it's not something, maybe it's not that complicated to change the phrase, but it's just if you're not even aware that they might not be very inclusive, it's just being aware of that and being able to recognize them. That's really good advice.
Yeah.
And keep learning. That's another recurring thing. Keep learning. It's a continuous learning, never ending journey. But it's also why it's exciting. I completely agree.
Absolutely.
I wanted to thank you again for joining us today, and thanks everybody else that is tuning in to listen to the Multilingual Content Podcast. And see you soon.
See you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.